Okay, today I'm going to talk about this distinction between subjective and objective. And I'm sure you all, pretty much know what that distinction is, but I'm going to clarify it a little more. It's a very important distinction. It could be taken, a lot of what I'm saying, basically, a lot of it comes from a philosopher named John Searle, who's a very famous linguistic philosopher. And he's the first person that has made this distinction the way I'm making it today. Okay, so subjective, objective. First of all, the distinction between subjective and objective can be taken in two different senses. It's very important to make the distinction. It could be taken epistemically, so you can have an one second. Sorry about that. Okay, so you can have an epistemic distinction, epistemic distinction, and an ontological distinction. So ontological. So you can take subjective in an epistemic way and then an ontological way. First of all, I'll talk about the epistemic way. Epistemic is referring to knowledge, okay? So if you're going to take it epistemically, we're talking about subjective statements or objective statements. So that's the epistemic use of subjective and objective is referring to statements. Statements can be subjective or objective, and the distinction is actually pretty simple. An objective claim is true independently of whether anyone believes it or not. So, for example, if it's raining outside, that's either true or false, and it doesn't really matter what anybody believes about it. If it's raining, it's true. If it's not raining, it's false. If the cat is on the mat, then the cat is on the mat. That's an objective claim, whether anyone believes it or not. On the other hand, for example, take a claim like chocolate tastes better than vanilla. Okay, that's a subjective claim. A subjective claim, its truth depends upon the person making the claim. So if for me chocolate tastes better than vanilla, then it's true for me. And if you think vanilla tastes better than chocolate, then my statement would be false. If I say, for example, here's another example. Shakespeare is a better poet than Milton, okay? That claim is subjective. It's epistemically subjective because it's a matter of taste, right? Somebody might think Shakespeare is better than Milton as a poet. Some people might think Milton is better than Shakespeare as a poet. So that's a subjective claim. So anyway, that distinction I think is pretty clear. Objective claims are true independently of whether anyone believes it. Subjective claims their truth or falsity depends upon the person making the claim. Okay? So that's subjective and objective in an epistemic way. If we're going to use it ontologically, we're not talking about statements anymore. We're talking about things or entities. So I'll give you an example in an ontological sense of the word. An objective, something that has an objective ontology, for example, would be a rock. What does that mean? Well, something has an objective ontology if it exists, whether anybody perceives it or not, whether anyone's looking, whether anyone is observing it. So rocks, mountains, trees, they exist objectively because they're there whether anyone looks at them or not. Okay, that's an objective, something that exists whether you look at it or not, has an objective ontology. Something which has a subjective ontology needs to be experienced by some subject, by some person or animal, or there has to be someone experiencing it. So pleasures and pains, beliefs, desires, all mental states have a subjective ontology because they cannot exist unless someone is experiencing them. I mean, you cannot have pain unless someone is in pain. So pains do not exist independently of a subject experiencing the pain. So so pains and pleasures have subjective ontologies. So subjective and objective, you can think of it epistemically or ontologically. In the epistemic sense of the word, subjective and objective refer to claims. So a claim can be subjective or objective. It's objective if its truth value is independent of what anyone believes. When you use subjective and objective in the ontological sense, you were referring to things that either exist independently of a subject experiencing them, or things that depend upon a subject. So in the ontological sense of the word, pleasures and pains, these have a subjective ontology. Pleasures, pains, and beliefs and desires, things like this. All mental states, beliefs. And this is a very important distinction. The person that has made this distinction, as I mentioned, is John Searle, who is one of the most important philosophers in the English-speaking world. And he's still living, so in the last 30, 40 years. Anyway, he taught at Berkeley. I guess he's emeritus now, professor at Berkeley. But this distinction he makes in his books, it's a very important distinction. So, so subjective and objective. Most things, then to explain this, I need to introduce another concept, which Searle makes. Let me see what time. Okay, so let me make another thing. Now we can talk about things that are observer independent. So I'll write the word observer independent. Well, I'll put observer dependent. No, I could do it if you want to do independent. Observer independent means something exists whether anyone looks at it or not, whether anyone's observing it. Independent. And observer relative. Okay, so some things exist only because someone is looking at them or observing them. Some things exist whether anyone's looking or not, like rocks, the example I gave. Anything that has an objective ontology is observer independent, right? So rocks over here, rocks and mountains. And they exist. These have an objective ontology. They're ontologically objective. They are observer independent. I'm looking at the time here, so okay, so I got 5 minutes. Okay, observer independent. Okay, observer relative, and then some things are observer relative. So anything that has a subjective, observer relative. Let me give you an example of something observer. Think of a dollar bill. Well, think of this pen. Okay, this pen, right, is a physical object, and it's made out of atoms and molecules and so on. So this object here as a physical object has an objective ontology. Objective ontology, right? Because it does not depend upon anybody perceiving it. It just exists. It has an objective ontology as an object. On the other hand, this is not simply a physical object. This is a pen, or whatever you call it. I'll call it a pen. It's a marker. All right, so sorry about that. I'm sorry about that. I dropped it. So this is a marker. Its being a marker is it means it has an it's ontologically subjective, because it is only a marker because we take it to be a marker, right? I mean, if somebody came from a different planet or Mars or whatever and they saw this, they would not see it as a marker or a pen. This is a pen because we take it to be a pen. Think of a dollar bill. A dollar bill is made out of atoms and physical material. As the physical object, the paper has an objective ontology. Its being a dollar bill has a subjective ontology. Okay, so now, okay, now one thing it's kind of I'll talk about this and I'll write you some notes on this to make it clearer. But beliefs and desire. So things that are having that have most things that have a subjective ontology, like something being a pen or a dollar bill, they have a subjective ontology, and they have a subjective ontology because they are observer relative. They exist only insofar as they are perceived by someone. Now, take feelings and pains and pleasures and beliefs and desires. They have a subjective ontology, but they are not observer relative. Pains, observer independent. So there are certain things that have a subjective ontology, like pains, pleasures, beliefs, desires, all mental states, actually, beliefs, desires, pains, pleasures. These have a subjective ontology because they can only exist insofar as they are experienced by a subject, but they are observer independent. They exist. If I'm in pain whether anyone knows it or not. So my pain is observer independent. It does not depend upon anybody perceiving me or the pain. So I think that's all I'm going to talk about right now, and I'll have to clarify it more. But so entities or objects can be observer independent or observer relative. They can have a subjective ontology or an objective ontology. Anything which has an objective ontology is observer independent. But things that have a subjective ontology can be observer relative, like something's being a dollar bill, but the material out of which it is made has an objective ontology. So, but pains and pleasures and beliefs have a subjective ontology, but they are observer independent. Okay, that's all I'm going to say today. If this is a very important distinction. I'll have to go over another time. But think about it, and it will become very important later on in in the rest of the course. I think that's all for today. I'll talk to you later. So.